Hi, we are walking into our 5th week in our series of Joy in a Junk-Filled World. Finding Joy is the shorter name for our series. And this particular week we're going to be talking about the joy of confidence in Christ. You know, Dennis, I was thinking about this theme of confidence. Part of what Paul talks about here is the difference between false confidence and confidence. So think of false confidence. I'm a football fan. I think you're a football fan.
Sure.
This year, as the Patriots' NFL season was about to begin, there was a lot of talk that this might be the best team that the Patriots had ever put together. Some of the sports writers were saying this is probably going to be a 16-0 series.
Yeah.
And then they walk into the very first game against the Kansas City Chiefs, and they got humbled real quickly.
They did.
And it became quite evident that this was not going to be a 16-0 season. In fact, Coach Belichick had been saying all along, stop talking about that kind of stuff, that you never know what you're going to get from year to year. And the truth is, this has been a rough first half for the Patriots, even though they're standing in first place in their division.
Yeah.
In the same way, this kind of false confidence can enter the religious picture as well. So Dennis, we were talking about this a little bit. Where do we see false confidence affect a Christian?
Oh, wow. Well, I think that people can get carried away and begin to think that their religious practices, gain them favor with God, and so by doing that kind of thing, that God's going to love me more than He does just love me before who I am. Now, unchurched people. A lot of those folks, you and I have had conversations, and we know that we've talked to people in the past. You ask them that inevitable question. So, if you were to die tonight, and you were to and you were to stand before God, and He would say, "So, for example, Paul, why should I let you into my heaven?" Some people say what?
And we get some strange answers there. Sometimes we say, "Well, I'm kind to animals. I'm good to other people."
Sure.
I've had people say, "I'm better than the guy down the street."
Yeah.
You know, when you talk with people about that sort of thing, there's a little technique that you use sometimes. Would you mind explaining those two words that you use?
Yeah. In fact, we use them in the training in the 401 class. And Bill Hybels is the one where we got this little saying from. And the concept is the difference between do versus done. And let me write that up here. Do versus done. And we're losing our sign.
Fix your E there so that it doesn't say don't.
Don't. So in do versus done, people who are saying, well, the way I'm going to get to heaven, what you were just saying, well, because I do this and I do this and I do this, I live a good life and all that sort of stuff. Like we used to joke, I don't smoke, spit, or chew, or go out with girls that do, that sort of thing. And so one of the things that happens, that's the concept of do versus a relationship with Jesus. This is religious practice. This is religion. Over here is done. That's a relationship with Christ, because Jesus says on the cross, the last thing He says is, it is finished. It is done. It is paid for. And so we get to heaven because of what Christ has done for us. Do versus done. I want to be over here with the done part. How about you? I know you've used some illustrations in the past to explain this.
Well, yeah, I've used one several times with people when we're talking about how they see themselves before God, and the goodness scale comes up, and they say, I'm a good person. And sometimes I will ask, well, how good is good? They'll say, what do you mean? I say, well, define what good is. You're relying on your eternal destiny is relying upon this idea that you've been good enough in view of all of God's expectations. And so sometimes I'll draw a little picture like this and say, you think you've been a good person, how good? If God's right up here and this is absolute holiness, with a holy, righteous God, and that's the top of the scale and the bottom's down here. Let's say we put Adolf Hitler, down here towards the bottom. Where would you put your mark? And just about the time that I hand them the pen and somebody's about to put his mark in here, I'll say, before you do that, I'd like to tell you, I read a few biographies, and I've read 3 biographies on Mother Teresa, for instance. And we taught one Sunday, what would Jesus say to Mother Teresa?
Wow. Okay.
And she had an interesting view of her own life. She felt that she had not really walked with God with fullness of intent for some period of her life,
Sure.
and that she'd squandered opportunities, and there were other times she was really resentful toward God, even though she served. And I felt safely that she'd put her mark right in here somewhere, and so this is Mother Teresa. And so I'll be talking with my friend and say, now you go just put in your mark anywhere you will. If Mother Teresa's over here, you're a little above her, a little below her. Yeah. And just about the time that person's ready, I'll say again, I've also read some biographies about Billy Graham, who, by the way, turned 99 this week.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And he talked about how he saw himself as a worm of a person because of the battles of pride that he'd gone through in his own life. And I felt confident that he put himself somewhere below Mother Teresa. So if we've got Billy Graham and Mother Teresa in here, I'll say to my friend, you just go ahead, put your mark anywhere you think. You're right up here. And usually they'll stop and say, well, I can't do that. And, the reason is that with God, his expectations are so high that the righteousness of God is perfection.
Yeah.
And this is why we need Jesus, because Jesus comes in and through the cross, Jesus gives us the righteousness that God demands, that not only makes up the gap, but it covers the whole gamut.
That's a great illustration. I think that's one that any of us could use, either one of these, in talking with our friends, who might have questions about, Christianity, about religion, and you begin to make this is a concept, religion versus relationship with Christ, relationship with Christ.
Now here's why all this is relevant. This week, as you're reading through the opening part of the 3rd chapter of Philippians, Paul talks about the false confidence that some of his opponents have. And the false confidence that they have is that they are basing their status with God and ultimately what they feel is their eternal destiny based on religious traditions. You have to remember, Paul was a Jew who became a follower of Jesus, and he tells us here in this chapter about his pedigree, that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, that he was among the most righteous of the righteous, that he was zealous for the law, that prior to his encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road, that he'd actually been rounding up Christians who he saw as aberrant Jews, and he was rounding them up and arresting them because he was so opposed to them. So Paul lays out all his pedigree, and essentially what he's doing is saying there's a false confidence that some people had based on the religious tradition of circumcision. And so Paul kind of invokes a pretty dark humor here. He says, if your confidence is in circumcision, why don't I just cut off whole parts of the body and really go for it? And the absurdity of what he is saying drives home a point. That it is not about any religious contribution that we make, that our confidence is all in Christ.
That's great. So, as we wrap up here, one of the things that we're going to challenge you to do is to begin to think through the implications of this. And as you walk through these 11 verses together as a small group, I think this is rich territory to explore, both for its implications and its applications. And we're trusting that God's going to continue to use this series and this particular study to help better equip you to not only walk with Christ in freedom, but to explain to your friends and your relatives, maybe even your workmates, classmates, the good news about the difference between religion and relationship, and not relying upon having confidence in ourselves, but in Christ. Any last thoughts?
Sure. I would love to see our groups wrestle with a couple of things.
Okay.
Here's the first one. What are the reasons for false confidence that Paul lists here in this chapter that his opponents are standing upon? What are our reasons for confidence as Christians? I'm not going to give them to you here. I'd like you to draw them out of the text. And then a third challenge would be to talk about where do we see that false confidence coming back in our day? What are the sources of false confidence that we work through? And are we truly relying on Jesus Christ for our salvation and our righteousness. Have a great study, my friends.